I lost my memory after diving into the ocean to save a powerful CEO, and she paid me back by becoming my wife. Even after our wedding, her heart remained tied to her first love who had been missing for years. The moment she finally got a lead on his whereabouts, she didn't hesitate to throw a $5 million check in my face. She told me they found him and demanded a divorce right then and there. I was seconds away from dropping to my knees to beg her not to leave when my entire past came rushing back to me. I realized I was actually Morrison Hawthorne, the sole heir to one of the wealthiest and most influential dynasties in the nation. I also remembered I had a fiancé from a childhood arrangement with another elite family. Right then, Sarah Anderson shoved the divorce papers in my hands. She told me to sign them and claimed the money would be more than enough to support me for the rest of my life. Without saying anything else, she turned around and hurried out the door without a single glance back. I signed the documents without a moment of doubt. Then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had not called in years. I simply asked the person on the other end if they knew who was calling. As soon as the question left my lips, the woman on the other end snapped back and asked if I was insane. She demanded to know how she was supposed to recognize me. I just smiled to myself and asked Ellie if she really failed to recognize my voice after all this time. I asked if I had been gone so long that she had forgotten me, or if she had just become arrogant in my absence. Ellie Thompson stayed silent for a few beats before shouting my name in disbelief that I was still alive. Her tone quickly shifted from shock to annoyance. She complained that I had vanished for 2 years without a single word, and said she assumed I had run off with some gold digger. I ignored her insult and gave her a direct order. I told her that I had just sent my location to her phone and that she needed to come pick me up immediately. When I walked out of the villa the next morning, a custom Ferrari, sparkling with diamonds, pulled up to the curb. A gorgeous blonde with piercing blue eyes stepped out and tried to wrap me in a hug. I coldly brushed her off and walked straight to the passenger side of the car. Ellie stomped her foot in frustration and called me a heartless jerk. She complained that she had flown through the night all the way from Europe just to see me, and this was how I treated her. I gave her a sharp look and told her it was time for us to leave. While she climbed into the driver's seat, I took a final look at the mansion I had lived in for the past 2 years. I realized I never truly belonged there, just as Sarah had never actually been mine. I had spent 2 years playing the part of her weak and obedient husband. Since I finally had my memories back, I needed to uncover exactly who had tried to murder me. 2 days later, Sarah came back to the house and went straight to her room to lock herself inside. She was clearly in a foul mood after her trip. It turned out her information was incorrect, and the man she found wasn't her first love after all. The entire journey had been a massive waste of time. While she was brooding, the housekeeper knocked on her door and handed her the signed divorce papers I had left behind. The housekeeper informed her that I had signed everything and moved out without taking a single possession or even the credit card she provided. Sarah frowned as she processed the news. She assumed I was just playing a game to get her sympathy since I was supposedly broke and had nowhere to go. Sarah decided she had to finish the legal process immediately before I could stir up any more drama. As soon as the housekeeper stepped out, her assistant, Tina Young, entered the room with an update. She told her boss that I had reappeared, but not at the house. Sarah looked visibly irritated because she assumed I was already crawling back to her. Tina quickly corrected her and explained that I hadn't returned to the villa, but had been spotted by the paparazzi. I had been caught on camera checking into a luxury hotel with Ellie Thompson, the famous European heiress. Tina added that we had spent the entire night together at the hotel. Sarah's face twisted with a mix of shock and disgust as she wondered how I could possibly know someone like Ellie Thompson. She figured I had simply found a new wealthy woman to support me, which explained why I didn't want her $5 million. This news only made her existing bad mood even worse. She reached out to her best friend, Sarah Collins, to see if she wanted to go grab some drinks to blow off steam. While she was fuming, I was sitting at the Apex Club in the heart of Manhattan, looking over a group of beautiful women. I had a confident smirk on my face as I relaxed in the VIP section. Ellie was busy with a business meeting in one of the private suites upstairs. She had invited some of her friends over so I wouldn't be lonely. I casually swirled the expensive brandy in my glass while observing the crowd. I asked one of the girls how old she was, and they all started giggling amongst themselves. One told me she was 23, while another mentioned she was 21. I was impressed by the group Ellie had put together because every single woman there was beautiful enough to give Sarah a run for her money. I reasoned that if she could dump me for her first love, there was no reason I couldn't enjoy myself. I flashed a smile at the woman sitting next to me and offered her a drink. I told her that if she made my night enjoyable, I would buy her a brand new sports car. Her eyes widened with excitement as she quickly poured me a fresh glass and moved in close to me. She purred a toast in my honor while the other girls noticed my wealth and crowded around. They were all competing for my attention, doing whatever they could to keep me entertained and the drinks flowing. In a private room upstairs, Sarah was having drinks with Sarah. Sarah eventually broke the silence and gently suggested that Sarah should stop looking for her first love. She pointed out that it had been many years and perhaps it was finally time to move on with her life. Sarah had spent half a decade and $30 million in reward money trying to track this man down to no avail. There wasn't a single lead left to follow. Sarah understood how resourceful her friend was and figured that if Sarah couldn't find him by now, he probably wasn't alive anymore. Sarah kept that grim thought to herself because she didn't want to upset her friend any further. Sarah remained silent and finished her entire glass in one gulp. Sensing the tension, Sarah decided to steer the conversation towards something less painful. Sarah asked if I was truly handling the divorce well. It was common knowledge that I had been obsessed with Sarah from the moment we met and had chased her tirelessly until she agreed to marry me. In reality, Sarah had only accepted my proposal to stop her family from nagging her about her personal life. After the wedding, I had spent every waking moment trying to earn her love. I would have given her the world if she had asked for it. Sarah couldn't understand how someone as devoted as I was could just walk away without a fight. She had a gut feeling that there was more to the story than they knew. Sarah's face became cold as stone as she thought about the reports of me staying at a hotel with Ellie. Right then, Sarah leaned over the railing and pointed at the crowd on the main floor. She asked if the man lounging in the VIP section looked familiar. Sarah rubbed her eyes and joked that it couldn't be me because I had never looked that attractive or confident before. Sarah narrowed her eyes and looked exactly where her friend was pointing. She saw a group of stunning women hovering around a man who was relaxing on a plush sofa. He had his long legs kicked up on the table and was slowly swirling his drink with an air of effortless, high-class confidence. When one of the women leaned in to pour him more, he looked up and gave her a smile that was dangerously handsome. Sarah watched from above, her heart skipping a beat as she realized who it was. Sarah's heart sank as she confirmed that the man below was indeed me. Sarah did a double take, her jaw nearly hitting the floor in shock. She couldn't believe it was really me and noted how all those beautiful women were practically throwing themselves at me like I was a magnet. Sarah's gaze turned icy as she watched my every move from the balcony. It was one thing for me to be seen at a hotel with Ellie Thompson, but seeing me openly flirting with a crowd of women in public was an entirely different insult. She felt a surge of anger and decided that I had finally pushed her too far. I was enjoying the company of the women around me when I felt a sudden, intense stare coming from across the room. I looked over and saw a very familiar woman walking toward me with purpose. I didn't let my surprise show. Instead, I let a slow, mocking grin spread across my lips as she approached. Sarah shoved her way past the girls and stood directly in front of my table. She sneered that the divorce papers weren't even dry yet, and I was already out acting like a bachelor. I just leaned back into the cushions and let out a soft, amused laugh at her indignation. I told her that life was too short and that I intended to make the most of every moment. Sarah looked down at me with pure disdain while Sarah whispered behind her. She wondered if being dumped had actually caused me to have some sort of mental breakdown. I didn't say a word. I just kept smiling up at them. I thanked Miss Collins for her concern with a playful wink. I then stretched my arms out and pulled the two women next to me closer to my sides. I asked them why on earth I would settle for a single tree when I could have the entire forest. Sarah was speechless because I had just compared her best friend to a common tree. This version of me was completely unrecognizable to both of them. Sarah glared at me as I sat there with a girl on each arm. She realized that the man she was looking at was a total stranger. I looked her right in the eyes with a clear sense of defiance. I asked her if she had a problem with my logic. I had to confess that she looked breathtaking tonight, possessing a cold and untouchable beauty that was hard to ignore. There was a dangerous glint in her eyes as she stared me down. Suddenly, a massive, intoxicated man stumbled over to our table and interrupted us. He made a crude comment about two beautiful women fighting over one man and suggested that they should leave with him instead. Sarah gave the man a look of pure revulsion and instinctively stepped back to avoid him. The heavy-set guy then turned his attention to me, pushing one of my guests out of the way. He mocked my build and boasted that he could take me down with a single hit. He reached out a sweaty hand to grab my shirt, but I was already ahead of him. A cold, lethal look flashed in my eyes as I reacted. Before his fingers could even graze my clothes, I struck him across the face with a force that echoed through the booth. The man let out a cry of pain as he collapsed onto the floor, cursing at me in disbelief. I didn't stop there. I delivered a powerful kick to his midsection that sent him sliding several feet across the floor. When his bodyguards saw what happened, they all rushed me at once. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I faced them, systematically dropping each one with a single, precise blow. The entire fight was over in less than 10 seconds. All four men were left groaning on the ground while the crowd watched in silence. I calmly brushed the dust off my jacket and sat back down to finish my drink as if nothing had happened. Sarah pointed a shaking finger at me, her face pale with shock. She stammered out a question, asking how I could possibly know how to fight like a professional. She couldn't believe that the mild-mannered man she knew had suddenly become a combat expert. She wondered if my entire personality over the last 2 years had been a lie. Sarah watched me closely, and the anger in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a look of genuine intrigue that brought a small smile to her face. It appeared her ex-husband was significantly more complex than she had given him credit for. He had spent 2 years being perfectly submissive, yet he had transformed into a completely different man the moment they parted ways. She also couldn't help but feel that his fighting style looked strangely familiar to her. A sense of suspicion began to grow in Sarah's mind as she analyzed my movements. I noticed that the women who had been surrounding me were now keeping a cautious distance, so I gestured for them to come back with a charming grin. I asked them why they had suddenly become so shy. Just as a couple of them stepped forward, Sarah sent an icy glare in their direction that stopped them dead in their tracks. The pure intimidation in her eyes made their legs feel weak, and they immediately hurried away to find another table. None of them wanted to mess with a woman who held that much power. Everyone knew that Sarah Anderson was the undisputed queen of the New York social scene, and crossing her was essentially social suicide. I gave her a bored look and told her that ruining someone else's fun was generally considered bad luck. She didn't look amused by my comment at all. She frowned and reminded me that the divorce wasn't official yet because of the mandatory 30-day waiting period required by law. She insisted that nothing could be finalized until that time had passed. I gave her a mocking grin and asked if she was starting to regret her decision already. She laughed off the suggestion and told me I was dreaming. I simply poured myself another glass and went back to my drink, which was fine by me. Sarah continued to watch me, looking entirely perplexed by the confident and flashy man I had become. Only a few days prior, I had been desperate and emotional, pleading with her to stay. Now, I was acting like she didn't even matter. She demanded to know exactly what was going on between me and Ellie Thompson. Her tone was sharp and left no room for deflection. I raised an eyebrow and told her that I wasn't obligated to discuss my private life with my future ex-wife. As soon as I said that, Ellie's voice rang out from behind us, sounding both shocked and hurt. She repeated the words back to us as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Ellie stood a few feet away and pointed a finger directly at Sarah, accusing me of marrying some gold digger without telling her. The air around Sarah practically turned to ice the moment she heard that insult. She looked like she was ready to snap for being called such a derogatory name. I gave Ellie a warning glance that told her to watch her mouth, and she quickly backed off with a teasing pout. I then turned back to Sarah and told her that a proper ex-wife should stay out of sight and mind. My comment was so arrogant that Sarah looked like she wanted to punch me right in the face. I brushed off her anger and gestured for Ellie to follow me out of the club. I told her we should go find a more interesting party elsewhere. Sarah stood there and watched us walk away, her eyes burning with a mix of betrayal and intense fury. A sudden realization hit her as she processed our interaction. She couldn't understand how I could possibly be on such intimate terms with someone as high-profile as Ellie Thompson. For the last 2 years, I had been a man without a past who never even left her house or held a job. There was no way I could have met Ellie while living under her roof, which meant we must have known each other before my accident. Sarah narrowed her eyes and instructed Sarah to run a comprehensive background check on Ellie Thompson. She was determined to find out exactly how we were connected. She took a moment before telling Sarah to investigate my background as well. Sarah agreed to help, but couldn't resist teasing her friend. She pointed out that for someone who had initiated the divorce, Sarah was acting exactly like a woman who had been heartbroken and left behind. Once we were away from the club, I headed directly back to the hotel. I only said we were going to another party to annoy Sarah and make her jealous. During the entire car ride, Ellie wouldn't stop talking as she tried to get every detail about my marriage to Sarah. I finally reached my limit and gave her the abbreviated version of the story. I explained that Sarah had saved me 2 years ago and I married her out of gratitude, but now that she wanted her first love back, we were finished. Ellie looked at me with total disbelief that someone as powerful as me needed saving. She reminded me that the Morrison Hawthorne she knew was the one who rescued others, not the victim. My face darkened as I told her that a professional hit had been put out on me. I explained that someone had actually hired the Black Shark mercenary group to take my life. Everyone in our world knew that the Black Sharks were a group of cold-blooded killers who would take any job if the payout was high enough. They had absolutely no regard for human life. I stared off into the distance, remembering the day I was ambushed in the jungle as a cold anger filled my eyes. Ellie asked me if I had figured out who had paid the mercenaries to hunt me down. I told her that I hadn't had the chance to investigate yet since my memory had only just returned 48 hours ago. I knew that finding the culprit was going to be my top priority from now on. Ellie's playful mood vanished as she promised to find the person responsible within 2 days. I gave her a simple nod of approval. She then suddenly remembered to tell me about a massive $30 million bounty that had been posted online for my capture. I was surprised by the amount and asked if the person who posted it wanted me dead or alive. Ellie confirmed that they wanted me brought and breathing. I figured that anyone willing to pay that much for a living target probably had a desperate need for my specific skills or influence. I wasn't too worried, because I knew that very few people were brave enough to actually try and collect a bounty on my head. I went back to my room to shower and relax, but a sudden thought interrupted my peace. I realized that a very important item was still in Sarah's possession. I had given her a precious heirloom as a wedding present back when I didn't know who I really was. Now that I had my memories, I realized how incredibly foolish I had been to give away something so vital. If I didn't get it back, it would be nearly impossible for me to manage my family's affairs properly. I knew I had to retrieve it as soon as possible. The following morning, Sarah stopped by Sarah's office to hand over the results of her investigation. She told Sarah that she had compiled every bit of information available on me into that single file. Sarah looked at the papers and was shocked to see only a few sentences written there. Sarah could only shrug and explain that my records were so heavily protected that it was impossible to find anything else. She told her boss that I was essentially a ghost in the system with no detectable history. The fact that my personal information was under high-level encryption deeply bothered Sarah. It was a clear sign that I wasn't just some ordinary person who had lost his way. She stared at the near-empty file with a growing sense of unease and curiosity about who I really was. Tina interrupted her thoughts to announce that I had arrived at the office. I didn't wait for an invitation and walked right in, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Sarah looked up, and for just a moment, She seemed genuinely impressed by the aura of power I now radiated. Sarah took an instinctive step backward because she was still intimidated by what she had seen me do at the club. I ignored her entirely and walked straight up to Sarah's desk with a clear goal in mind. I demanded that she return the jade pendant I had given her. Sarah looked at me and felt a wave of nervousness because I seemed like a completely different person than the husband she had known. She nervously asked which pendant I was talking about. I let out a bitter laugh because I had expected her to have completely forgotten about such a valuable gift. I could still vividly recall how she hadn't even looked at it when I presented it to her on our wedding day. My voice was like ice as I reminded her of the specific pendant I had given her when we tied the knot. I made it clear that I wasn't leaving without it. She took a second to think and eventually recalled seeing a necklace when she first rescued me from the sea. She remembered it had my name carved into the stone. She leaned back in her executive chair and watched me closely, trying to figure out why it was suddenly so important. She asked if I had really come all the way to her office just for a piece of jewelry. I crossed my arms and asked her what other reason I could possibly have for visiting her. I mocked the idea that she thought I was there to plead for a second chance at our marriage. She remained silent, her expression completely unreadable as I spoke. I felt a sense of satisfaction in knowing that I was finally moving on from her. I told myself that I was eager to become nothing more than a memory to her, and that we would never be together again. I didn't want to spend another minute bickering with her, so I held out my hand and demanded she hand it over immediately. Sarah just looked away and told me she had already gotten rid of it. I was stunned into silence, unable to believe she had actually tossed such a priceless heirloom into the trash. She calmly took a drink of her coffee and told me that she wasn't obligated to keep every gift I gave her. My anger boiled over, and I slammed my fist on her desk, demanding to know exactly where she had disposed of it. I was barely holding back my fury at her carelessness. She looked me in the eye and simply said she didn't remember what happened to it. I squeezed my fist tight to stop myself from doing something I might regret. She saw the lethal look in my eyes, and, strangely enough, she seemed to be enjoying how much she was getting under my skin. She had never seen me lose my temper like this during our entire time together. We stayed locked in a silent confrontation until I suddenly started laughing. I told her she had 10 days to find that pendant. If she failed, I promised to cancel the divorce proceedings immediately. I reminded her that the law allowed either of us to stop the divorce at any time during the first month. Sarah's face went pale as she realized I had found a way to trap her. She convinced herself that I was just using the pendant as an excuse to keep her in my life. She was certain that the necklace was just a pawn in a larger game I was playing. My grin grew wider as I pointed out that if we stayed married, her beloved first love would never be anything more than her secret lover. I knew that would hit her right where it hurt. Sarah stood up and walked toward me, her eyes burning with rage as she yelled that she would get her divorce no matter what it took. I let out a chilling laugh and told her that finding my pendant was her only option. I threatened to make her entire company suffer if she failed to return my property. I warned her that she had one final opportunity to settle this quietly before I turned and left the room. As I walked out, I ran into a man with bleached blonde hair who was heading toward the office. I recognized him immediately as one of the people who had made my life difficult. It was Mark Sterling, the spoiled heir to a massive fortune and a man who had been obsessed with Sarah for years. He had constantly looked down on me throughout my entire marriage. He stopped in his tracks the second he saw me leaving Sarah's private suite. He pointed a finger in my face and demanded to know why I was there. I told him to mind his own business and keep moving. In the past, I had always acted like a pushover to make Sarah happy, but those days were officially over. I used to let him insult me, or I would just walk away to avoid a scene. Now, Mark was completely speechless because the man he used to bully was finally standing up to him. He didn't know how to handle the new version of me. He sneered at me and asked why I was still acting like a lost dog now that Sarah was dumping me. I gave him a calm smile and reminded him that we were still very much married in the eyes of the law. I enjoyed watching the smug look on his face disappear. Mark stepped closer and pointed right at my nose, telling me that everyone knew she didn't love me. I just brushed his comment aside and told him that her feelings didn't change my legal status. I made it clear that as long as those papers weren't filed, I was the one she belonged to. Mark lost his temper and accused me of being nothing more than a gold digger looking for a massive settlement. He pulled a checkbook out of his pocket, scribbled something down, and threw the paper right at my face. He thought he could buy me off just like everyone else. He told me to take the $1 million and disappear from her life forever. I stared at him for a moment before picking up the check with a bored expression. I told him that $1 million was only enough to buy him exactly 60 minutes of my time. Mark looked at me with confusion and demanded to know what I meant. He shouted that he wanted me gone for good and asked if I was really crazy enough to think $1 million wasn't a fair price. I just clicked my tongue in disappointment at his lack of perspective. I told him he was making a fool of himself by acting like a single $1 million was a lot of money. With a quick movement, I flicked the check back at him. The paper was moving so fast that it sliced his cheek like a blade. A thin line of blood immediately started to trail down his face. He grabbed his cheek in shock and was horrified to see blood on his fingers. He started screaming that he was going to kill me for what I had done. I just laughed and reminded him that much more dangerous men had tried to kill me and failed. I asked him what made him think he was any different. Mark lost his mind and threw a punch at me with everything he had. I caught his arm before he could touch me and applied just enough pressure to break the bone. The sound of his wrist snapping echoed through the hall, followed by a high-pitched scream of pure agony. He collapsed to the floor, cradling his broken arm, which was now hanging at a grotesque angle. I stood over him and told him that if he didn't learn to stay away from me, I would do much worse than break a bone next time. I didn't feel a single ounce of pity for him. Sarah suddenly appeared and demanded to know what I was doing to Mark. As soon as Mark saw her, he turned on the waterworks and claimed that I had just tried to murder him in the hallway. He was acting like a terrified child to get her attention. I turned around and dusted off my hands, telling her that I was simply cleaning up the building. Sarah didn't appreciate my humor and quickly ordered her staff to get Mark to an emergency room. She then looked at me and told me to go apologize to him for the assault. Our families have been business partners for a long time, and hurting the Sterlings' only heir was going to cause a massive headache for everyone. I looked at Sarah as if she had lost her mind when she suggested that I owed that man anything. I couldn't believe she was taking his side after everything he'd done. I decided I was done with the conversation and started to walk away, but she grabbed my arm to stop me. I immediately shook her off and warned her never to touch me again. I asked her if she really thought I was still the same weak husband she had been walking all over for 2 years. Sarah was standing nearby and could only watch in shock as I stood up to her best friend. Sarah looked like she was ready to kill me herself as she asked if I was looking for an early grave. I just laughed in her face and told her she was more than welcome to try and stop me. She warned me that Ellie Thompson's protection wouldn't save me from her if I kept acting like this. I just smirked and asked if she was feeling jealous that I finally found someone who actually cared about me. I could see that my words were hitting a nerve. Sarah struggled to find a comeback because she didn't want to admit how much my change in attitude was bothering her. She tried to dismiss my behavior as a desperate attempt to get her attention by playing hard to get. She told me to give up because it wasn't going to work on her. I gave her a look of pure disbelief and asked her if she really had such a high opinion of herself. I made it clear that I wasn't playing any games and that I was truly done with her. I walked out of the building, leaving her standing there with a look of cold fury on her face. Sarah waited until I was out of earshot before she dared to speak to her friend. She asked if that was really the same man who had been so head over heels in love with Sarah just a few days ago. Sarah was just as confused as she was. She didn't know how someone could change that much that fast. She couldn't wrap her head around my sudden transformation. I headed back to my hotel to relax, but it wasn't long before my phone rang with a call from Lily Anderson. She was one of the few people from that family I actually liked. Lily was the complete opposite of her sister. She was kind, cheerful, and had always been good to me. She told me she had heard the news and wanted to make sure I was doing okay. She suggested that we meet up so she could cheer me up. She was the only member of the Anderson family who had treated me like a human being while I had no memory. Since I was planning to leave the city shortly, I wanted to do something special for her as a final thank you. I agreed to meet her at the mall for the afternoon. I decided to surprise her by taking her directly to the Hermes store she loved so much. When we left 30 minutes later, she was clutching a rare, diamond-encrusted Birkin bag and looked like she was in a dream. It was a bag she had wanted for years, but could never get her hands on. Even though she came from a wealthy family, spending nearly $500,000 on a purse was beyond anything she had ever experienced. She looked at the bag and then back at me, asking if I was actually serious about giving it to her. She couldn't believe I had just spent that much money so casually. I told her to consider it an early birthday gift since her big day was coming up next month. She was so overwhelmed with emotion that she could barely find the words to thank me. She called me the best person ever, but then asked the obvious question of how I could afford such an expensive gift. She was genuinely baffled because she thought I was completely broke after leaving her sister. She knew I hadn't had a job for the last 2 years, so she didn't understand where the funds were coming from. I just told her it was from my old savings, which made her realize I had been keeping secrets. She shouted in excitement as she realized that my memory had finally returned. I gave her a small nod to confirm her suspicion. It all started to make sense to her now. She realized that the change in my personality was because I finally knew who I was again. Her eyes were full of wonder as she guessed that I must be coming from an incredibly wealthy background. I just laughed and told her that I wasn't exactly a billionaire's son, implying that I was the one in charge. She joked that she wanted me to be her benefactor now that she knew I was loaded. I took her on a massive shopping spree, and we hit every high-end boutique in the entire mall. By the end of the day, she had enough bags to fill a car. I dropped her off and headed back to my room, but my phone started ringing the second I walked through the door. I saw Lily's name on the screen, but it was a man's voice on the other end. He identified me as her brother-in-law and told me I had exactly 30 minutes to reach the old Thorn estate. He warned me that if I wasn't there in time, she wouldn't be coming home alive. Lily was being held captive at the estate with her hands tied and her mouth taped shut. She was being watched by 2 massive guards who didn't let her out of their sight for a second. The man finished his call and gave instructions to his men to keep her ready. He ordered them to untie her, and as soon as she was free, she ripped the tape off and started screaming at him. She demanded to know if Wesley Thorne had completely lost his mind. She couldn't believe he was actually bold enough to kidnap her in broad daylight. The city was run by the 3 major families, and although they weren't friends, they all knew each other well. Wesley tried to tell her to relax and promised he had no intention of actually hurting her. He said he was just using her as a tool to get to me. He explained that he needed a guaranteed way to bring me to his estate. Lily realized with horror that this was all about what I had done to Mark Sterling earlier that day. Since Wesley and Mark were best friends, he was setting a trap to get revenge on Mark's behalf. She panicked and tried to find a way to warn me, but the guards were too fast and blocked her from reaching a phone. She screamed at Wesley that I was still married to her sister and that Sarah would make him pay if he touched a hair on my head. She hoped the mention of her sister's name would be enough to scare him. Wesley just laughed and told her she wasn't fooling anyone with her threats. He reminded her that the whole city knew Sarah couldn't stand me and had ignored me for our entire marriage. He was determined to hurt me and make sure I never forgot what happens when someone crosses his friends. Lily was so angry that she threw a glass at him and told him he was wrong. She insisted that her sister still cared for me and that Sarah would personally ensure he suffered if I was harmed. She refused to back down, even though she was completely outnumbered. Wesley easily avoided the glass and relaxed in a chair, clearly unimpressed by her outburst. He pointed out that Sarah had treated me like garbage for years, so it was unlikely she would suddenly start caring now. He didn't believe for a second that Sarah would retaliate for a man she was actively trying to divorce. A look of pure malice took over his face as he vowed to break both of my arms as payback for what I did to Mark. He ordered his men to take their positions by the entrance and wait for me to arrive. He wanted to see me broken and crawling on the floor before the night was over. Lily lost her cool and tried to physically attack him, calling him every name in the book. She shouted that she would kill him herself if he didn't let her go. The guards easily caught her and held her back before she could get anywhere near him. Wesley told her he didn't want to have to hurt her, but warned that his patience was running thin. He had barely finished his sentence when the sound of a car speeding into the driveway reached their ears. He smirked and noted that I had arrived much sooner than he had expected. Lily was terrified for me and hoped that it was her sister coming to the rescue instead of me walking into a trap. She had been smart enough to send a distress message to Sarah before they took her phone away. She just hoped that her sister had received it and was bringing help. Wesley sat back with a confident look on his face, waiting for me to walk through the door. His expression quickly changed to one of pure shock when he heard the sounds of his guards being taken out in the courtyard. He started to wonder if he had underestimated who was coming for him. The noise outside ended as suddenly as it had started, and then I stepped into the room. I was casually spinning a metal baton that I had taken off one of his men as if I didn't have a care in the world. Wesley looked at me as if he was seeing a ghost, his confidence completely gone. I stood there with an intensity that seemed to drain the air out of the room, and Lily immediately realized it was me. She shouted at me to run away while I still could, promising that they wouldn't actually harm her. She was more worried about my safety than her own. Wesley finally regained his voice and ordered his men to shut her up. However, I was already moving before they could react, appearing like a blur across the room. Two heavy thuds echoed through the space as my strikes hit their marks. Lily didn't even have time to process what was happening before the guards holding her were on the floor. I had taken one out with a quick strike to the head and sent the other across the room with a powerful kick. It looked completely effortless on my part. They both went down instantly without being able to make a sound. Wesley panicked and started shouting for the rest of his security team to come inside and help him. I just gave him a cold smile and told him that his men outside wouldn't be coming to save him. Wesley was left speechless as he realized that I had just neutralized 20 of his best men single-handedly. He couldn't wrap his head around how I had done it so fast. They hadn't even managed to slow me down for more than a few minutes. He couldn't understand where this power was coming from, especially from someone he thought was a weakling. My face remained calm, but the anger in my eyes was terrifying as I looked at him. I told him that hurting people I cared about was a mistake that would cost him dearly. Wesley seemed unable to move under the weight of my stare. He felt completely overwhelmed by the situation. Despite his fear, he felt like he had to do something to save face since he had promised to get revenge for Mark. He didn't want to look like a coward. He tried to act tough and told me that if I scarred my own face and broke my arms, he would consider the matter settled and let us go. I couldn't help but smirk at the absurdity of his demand. I told him that was easily the most pathetic joke I had heard in my entire life. Lily held onto my arm and begged me to just leave with her and forget about him. I gave her a reassuring look and told her to head out to the car and wait for me there. She looked back at me with a lot of concern, unsure of what I was about to do. She whispered my name, but I told her again that everything was under control and she needed to leave. She finally listened and walked toward the exit, but she had barely made it out of the room when a terrifying scream echoed from the house. She froze, her heart racing as she wondered what was happening to Wesley. She was about to run back inside to help me when I walked out the front door looking perfectly fine. She ran over and grabbed my hands, asking if I was hurt in any way. I just looked at her and told her that I was completely unharmed. She looked me over to make sure I wasn't hiding any injuries, and once she was sure I was okay, she finally started to breathe again. As we walked toward the gate, she saw all the men I had taken down lying all over the driveway. It was a scene of total devastation that she wouldn't soon forget. She covered her mouth in shock, unable to believe that I had managed to take out so many professional killers all by myself. She looked at me with absolute awe and told me that I was officially the coolest person she had ever met. She promised to tell everyone about how brave I was. I was about to say something back when two high-end cars came racing up the driveway toward us. Lily recognized her sister's Bentley immediately and started waving her arms to get their attention. She shouted that she was safe and over by the entrance. Both vehicles came to a sudden stop right in front of us, and Sarah stepped out of her car, looking as poised as ever. She looked at Lily, who was jumping up and down with excitement, and realized that her sister didn't seem traumatized by the kidnapping at all. If anything, she looked thrilled. She turned her attention to me and demanded to know why I was at the Thorne estate. She looked past me toward the house and saw the guards I had left unconscious on the front steps. I just gave her a confident, slightly mischievous grin in response. I told her that I was the one responsible for the mess and explained that I had been threatened with Lily's life. Lily grabbed Sarah's arm and insisted that she owed me a massive thank you. She told her sister that I had saved her from a potentially terrible situation. I told her it wasn't necessary because I knew the kidnappers were only using Lily to get to me. While we were talking, a woman who looked to be around Sarah's age stepped out of the second car. She carried herself with an air of authority that suggested she was someone important. Victoria Thorne apologized for her brother's actions and gave us both a respectful nod. Lily just rolled her eyes. She couldn't believe how much better looking and more reasonable Victoria was compared to her idiot brother. It was hard to believe they were even related. Victoria looked at the downed guards with a look of pure disgust and muttered that her brother was insane for targeting the Anderson family. She sent her assistant into the house to check on him. She knew this was going to be a diplomatic nightmare for her family. The assistant returned a moment later, looking pale and struggling to get his words out. Victoria demanded to know what was wrong with her brother. The man finally stammered out that Wesley's pinky finger had been cut off and he was currently unconscious from the shock. Victoria looked horrified by the news, and Sarah immediately turned her gaze toward me, realizing I was the culprit. Victoria followed her look and asked if I was the one who had maimed her brother. I stared back at her without a hint of remorse and admitted that I was responsible. I told her that he should consider himself lucky that I only took a finger after what he did to Lily. Lily was completely stunned that I had gone that far, but she realized that's why I had insisted she wait outside. I was trying to protect her from seeing the violence. Lily was touched that even in the middle of a violent confrontation, I was still thinking about her well-being. Victoria looked like she was about to explode with anger as she stared me down. She had heard that I was a weakling, but the man standing before her was anything but. The social circles were full of stories about how I was a total pushover who couldn't even stand up for himself. Yet, this supposedly weak man had just dismantled an entire security team and maimed her brother. Victoria turned to Sarah to complain about my behavior. I interrupted her and made it clear that I wasn't Sarah's husband anymore. Sarah looked genuinely hurt and frustrated as she hissed my name, wondering why I was so determined to distance myself from her in front of everyone. Lily watched the exchange, started to see the tension between them. Lily was confused because her sister was the one who had asked for the divorce in the first place, yet she was the one acting like her heart was being broken. It was a complete role reversal. I just rolled my eyes and decided I had enough of the family drama for one night. I told Victoria that she was welcome to try and get revenge, but I suggested she bring a much larger team next time if she wanted to stand a chance. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and took off into the night before anyone could say another word. I was done with both of them. Lily watched as my car disappeared in the distance, still buzzing with adrenaline from the night's events. She told her sister all about how I had single-handedly taken down every single person Wesley had hired. She couldn't stop talking about how impressive I had been. Sarah remained silent, staring down the road as she tried to process the new side of me she had just witnessed. Victoria, on the other hand, was starting to feel a strange sense of attraction to the man who had just humiliated her family. She was impressed that I hadn't even been injured in such a massive fight. She realized that there was a lot more to me than met the eye. Victoria told Sarah that I was quite the fascinating character. Lily immediately jumped in and told Victoria to stay away from me, reminding her that I was still technically her sister's husband. Victoria gave a playful grin and said she would just have to wait a few more weeks until the papers were filed. Sarah looked like she was ready to start another fight right there, telling Victoria she wouldn't dare try anything. Victoria was surprised by how much Sarah seemed to care, which only made her more curious about me. Victoria pointed out that since Sarah was getting rid of me, she shouldn't have an issue with someone else taking an interest. Sarah simply told her to go ahead and try, but the look in her eyes was a clear threat. She then added that Victoria needed to make sure her brother stayed far away from her family in the future. She made it clear that Wesley wouldn't be as lucky if he ever tried something like that again. Victoria knew she didn't have a leg to stand on because her brother was completely in the wrong. She knew that even without my intervention, Sarah would have destroyed him for kidnapping Lily. She figured that a single finger was a small price to pay for such a valuable life lesson. She hoped that her brother would finally learn to stop being so impulsive. After making sure her point was understood, Sarah took Lily and drove away from the estate. I walked into my room to find Ellie looking thrilled as she pointed at her computer screen. She told me she had finally found what we were looking for. She had managed to hack into the Black Shark database and found the specific contract that had been put out on me. There was an account number attached to the payment, and she had used it to trace the money back to the original source. She handed me the tablet so I could see the name for myself. As I looked at the screen, my face turned to stone because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The contract had been paid for by the Hawthorne family right in Chicago. My own relatives were the ones who had tried to have me murdered, which was almost too much to process. I was just about to reach out to my grandfather when a breaking news notification caught my attention. The headline announced that my cousin Caleb was marrying Jessica Sterling, the woman I was supposed to marry. There was a photo of the two of them looking happy in their wedding clothes. I was stunned to see that the woman I had been engaged to for half a decade was already moving on with my own cousin. I couldn't believe they were actually going through with it and had already finished their wedding portraits. It was clear they had completely written me off as dead. I immediately started a deep dive into everything that had happened with my family while I was gone. I found two pieces of information that were particularly disturbing. The family had held a massive public funeral for me 2 years ago, convincing the entire world I was gone. Even worse, my grandfather had apparently suffered a major stroke and was now completely paralyzed and unable to speak. My grandfather knew me better than anyone and would have never accepted my death without physical proof. There was also no way my family should have known the details of the ambush or my fall unless they were involved. It was becoming clear that they had planned the whole thing. I looked at the account number again and realized the motive was purely financial. Since my parents had passed away, I was the only thing standing between my Uncle Richard and the Hawthorne fortune. With me out of the picture, he and Caleb would be the ones to inherit everything. Everything finally clicked into place, and the betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. Ellie poured me a glass of whiskey and told me that she had come prepared with enough resources to destroy my entire family, if that's what I wanted. She was ready to help me get my revenge. I told her to stay out of the situation because I wanted to handle this personally. She sat down and asked if I was really going to let them get away with it. I finished my drink and asked her, with a touch of irony, if she really thought a nice guy like me would let such a thing go unpunished. Ellie laughed and said she was glad to see that my time away hadn't made me any less ruthless. She told me to get ready because we were heading to Chicago first thing in the morning. I was too restless to sleep that night, so I used the private jet ride to finally get some rest. I spent most of the day in my hotel room, catching up on more sleep after we touched down. I didn't get up until 9 in the evening, and after a quick meal, I made my way to my family's estate. The Hawthornes were one of the half-dozen families that had dominated American commerce for over 100 years. While the New York social scene was controlled by the Andersons and their allies, Chicago was dominated by a different set of power players. The Hawthornes had spent decades competing with the Montgomerys and the Sterlings for control over the city. The Montgomery family had left the country 20 years ago, and the Sterlings had been falling apart due to their own internal conflicts. This had allowed the Hawthorne family to become the single most powerful entity in the entire region. We had essentially taken over everything. My grandmother owed her life to the Sterling family's matriarch, and they had been best friends for as long as I could remember. To show her gratitude, my grandmother had used her influence to keep the Sterlings afloat and eventually arrange for our families to be joined by marriage. As soon as I was old enough, I was brought home to finalize my engagement to Jessica Sterling. Our engagement party was the biggest social event of the year and was covered by every major news outlet. The mere announcement caused the Sterling family's company value to skyrocket overnight. That alliance was the only reason the Sterlings were still relevant today. I arrived at the Hawthorne mansion and decided to climb over the back wall to avoid being seen. I was surprised to find that the security was much more intense than it had been when I was living there. I checked his private quarters on the estate, but found the entire place empty. It was clear he wasn't being cared for at home like they had claimed. I started to suspect that my Uncle Richard had moved him to some remote facility to keep him isolated. Since my grandfather wasn't there, I decided to pull back, but I made a mistake and set off one of the new sensors. Alarms started screaming throughout the mansion, and I could hear the security team closing in on my position. I rushed up to the third floor to find a place to hide while I figured out an exit. I encountered a guard in the corridor and took him down with one hit before he could raise his weapon. I ducked into the first open door I saw, hoping to jump from the balcony to make my getaway. As soon as I stepped inside, someone lunged at me from the shadows. I pushed my attacker back and realized it was Sarah Anderson standing in front of me. I was stunned to see her in Chicago, and she looked equally horrified to find me in her room. She couldn't believe I was the intruder who had just triggered the entire estate security system. We could both hear the guards' boots thumping on the carpet outside as they searched the rooms. I didn't have time to talk, so I immediately ducked into her bathroom to hide. Just as I closed the door, someone started pounding on her bedroom door. I stayed perfectly still, listening to the guard ask her if she had seen the intruder. I was surprised when she lied for me and told them she was alone. I felt a massive sense of relief that she hadn't given me up to my uncle's men. Once the room was quiet again, she told me I could come out of hiding. I stepped back into the bedroom, and she immediately demanded to know what I was doing in Chicago. I just looked at her with a smirk and prepared to give her an equally difficult question. I asked her what she was doing in my family's home, which left her looking completely bewildered. She asked me if I was really a Hawthorne, but I just reminded her that the house definitely didn't belong to her. I noticed a glass of juice on the nightstand and finished it in one go because I was incredibly thirsty. She looked at me with deep suspicion because she had never heard of a Morrison in the Hawthorne family tree. She reasoned that if I were actually related to them, the security team wouldn't have been hunting me like a criminal. I just told her that the truth would come out eventually, and she just had to be patient. I wasn't about to give her the full story yet because I needed my return to be a surprise for my uncle. I turned to check the balcony for more guards, but I suddenly felt a wave of dizziness. My legs gave out before I could even make it halfway across the room. She thought I had been shot and quickly grabbed me to keep me from falling to the floor. When she looked at my face, she saw that it was bright red and I was breathing heavily. She immediately realized something was wrong and looked over at the empty glass I had just finished. She remembered that Caleb's cousin, Leo King, had left that drink in her room just a few minutes ago. It was clear that the juice had been spiked with something potent. I started pulling at my shirt as a sudden, intense heat began to take over my entire body. I lost the ability to resist and pulled her close to me. She tried to steady me and told me to stay strong, but the drug was already too far gone. Without thinking, I pulled her in and pressed my lips against hers. Sarah felt a sudden rush of emotion as she kissed me, her pulse racing wildly. The sensation was hauntingly similar to an experience she'd had half a decade ago. She looked at me with a mix of wonder and confusion, wondering if I could actually be the person she had been searching for all this time. My mind slipped into a hazy dream of a rainy night from 5 years in the past. I remember being on a medical mission in a war zone when everything went wrong. I had been taken and held in the dark, and I could still remember the voice of the woman who refused to leave my side despite my pleas. I woke up a few hours later and was stunned to see Sarah sleeping right next to me. I couldn't believe it because she had spent our entire marriage making sure we never even had a single moment of physical intimacy. I sat up and tried to piece together how we had ended up like this. The fog in my brain finally lifted, and I remembered everything about the spiked drink and what happened afterward. I realized that the drug had caused me to lose control, and she had been caught in the crossfire. I saw her eyes starting to move and knew she was about to wake up. Before she could see me, I delivered a quick strike to her neck to knock her back out. She slumped back onto the pillows before she could even say a word. I let out a long breath, got dressed as fast as I could, and vanished from the mansion before the sun came up. When she finally woke up for good, She found herself completely alone in the guest room. The state of the bed and the marks on her own skin were the only proof that what happened wasn't just a hallucination. She felt a surge of confusing emotions as she looked around the silent room. She touched the sore spot on her neck and cursed my name under her breath. She couldn't believe I had the nerve to sleep with her and then knock her out so I could run away. Her phone suddenly buzzed with 2 new notifications on her nightstand. She checked her screen and saw that I had sent her an iMessage. When she opened it, she saw a Venmo notification for less than $10 along with a single word describing my experience as unimpressed. She looked like she was about to throw her phone through the wall. She stared at the insulting amount I had sent her, her anger reaching a boiling point. She wondered what kind of woman I thought she was to treat her like a cheap service. The review I had attached to the payment was the most offensive thing she had ever experienced. She forced herself to calm down and called her assistant to arrange for a ride home. She had originally visited the Hawthorns to talk business with my uncle, but a clumsy maid had ruined her outfit, forcing her to borrow a guest room to get cleaned up. That was the only reason she was in that room in the first place. She realized that the spiked drink was meant for her and that my family had tried to take advantage of her. A cold, lethal determination took over her as she vowed to make them pay for their mistake. Her driver pulled up to the gate just as she was finishing her thought. As soon as she sat down in the back seat, Tina handed her a new dossier. She told her boss that despite her best efforts, she couldn't find a single link between me and Ellie Thompson in any public or private records. It was as if our meeting at the club had been our very first encounter. Sarah looked over the papers with a grim expression, convinced that Tina was missing something. She knew that someone as wealthy as Ellie wouldn't act so submissive toward me unless there was a deep history between us. Just thinking about me being with another woman was starting to make her feel a strange sense of possessiveness. She realized I was full of secrets she had never even suspected during our marriage. She was desperate to know what my real role was within the Hawthorne dynasty and what exactly happened between us the night before. She took a deep breath and tried to call me to get some answers. I finally answered the phone after several rings, sounding like I had just been pulled out of a deep sleep. Before she could even say hello, she heard a woman's voice in the background on my side of the call. It was a sound that made her blood run cold. Ellie asked me who was on the phone, and Sarah felt a surge of pure fury at the sound of her voice. She couldn't understand why Ellie was in my room so early in the morning. She immediately jumped to the conclusion that we had spent the entire night in each other's arms. I realized who was calling and didn't feel like dealing with her, so I just ended the call. When she tried to ring me again, she realized I had already blocked her. She whispered my full name to herself, a lethal grin forming on her face as she decided she wasn't going to let me go that easily. She vowed that I wasn't going to escape her grasp, no matter how hard I tried. Meanwhile, Ellie was standing by my bedside and laughing at how quickly I had dismissed my ex-wife. I gave her a sharp look to let her know I wasn't in the mood for her jokes. I asked her if she had any leads on my grandfather's location. She told me she had tracked him down to a nursing home on the outskirts of the city. I immediately got dressed and prepared to go find him, hoping I wasn't too late. I arrived at the facility and noticed there were several men stationed outside his door. I waited for a gap in their patrol and ducked into a nearby office to find a disguise. I walked back out into the hall a few minutes later, looking like just another member of the medical staff. A guard stopped me at the door and told me I couldn't go in because the young master was visiting. I just nodded and kept my head down, knowing he was talking about my cousin Caleb. I felt a surge of anger knowing he was in there with my grandfather. Caleb was busy trying to force my grandfather's thumb onto a legal document to steal his signature. He was trying to finalize the paperwork that would make him the sole heir to our family's wealth as soon as he married Jessica. He was literally robbing a dying man. Caleb looked down at my grandfather with a look of pure hatred and told him that he had made a mistake by choosing me as his successor. He complained that the old man had always been biased toward my branch of the family. He sounded like a bitter child who had finally gotten what he wanted. He mocked the years of effort my grandfather had put into training me, only for me to be killed by my own relatives. He whispered into the old man's ear that his own favoritism was the reason they had to be so heartless. He had no remorse for what they had done to me. He was especially angry that my grandfather had promised Jessica to me instead of him. He gloated about how his father was now in control and how he would eventually take over everything. He vowed that Jessica would belong to him and no one else. He let out a chilling laugh and told the old man not to worry about the family business. He said they were going to lead the Hawthorns into a new era of power, even though my grandfather wouldn't be alive to witness it. He was already planning for the old man's death. He admitted that the only reason my grandfather was still breathing was to avoid any legal suspicion before the inheritance was finalized. He promised that once the wedding was over, they would dispose of him for good. I stood in the hall and listened to every word, my anger reaching a dangerous level. I realized that his medical condition wasn't an accident, but another part of their calculated plan. Caleb walked out of the room a few seconds later, busy on a call about his wedding attire. He walked right past me without even realizing who I was. I stared at him as he walked away, already planning my move. With the wedding only 3 days away, I decided I was going to give them a surprise they would never forget. I was going to make sure their big day turned into a total nightmare. Once the coast was clear, I went inside to see the man who had raised me. He looked so frail and weak with a mask over his face, a far cry from the strong man I remembered. He had spent his entire life staying in top shape, but now he looked like he was barely holding on. He used to be able to out-train men who were 40 years younger than him. Now, he was nothing but skin and bones, and his complexion was a sickly shade of yellow. I felt a surge of fear that I might be too late to save the only family member who truly loved me. I grabbed his arm to check his vitals and realized something was very wrong with his symptoms. It became clear that he hadn't suffered a stroke at all. Someone had been slowly poisoning him for months. I couldn't believe my uncle was evil enough to do that to his own father. I wanted to hunt my uncle down right then, but I knew I had to focus on saving my grandfather first. I pulled out some specialized medicine I always kept on me and placed it under his tongue. It was a powerful antidote that would hopefully buy him some more time. I slipped out of the building to avoid being noticed by the returning guards and headed to a cafe to call Ellie. We worked out a plan to get him out of there safely and into a secure location. Once we had everything ready, I went back to the nursing home to finish the job. I was shocked to find that someone had beaten me to it. The guards were already on the ground, and my grandfather was nowhere to be found. I felt a wave of terror as I looked at the empty hospital bed. I had no idea who could have taken him. I couldn't believe he had vanished in a short time I was gone. I got a text from a number I didn't recognize, and when I saw the image, I felt like my heart had stopped. It was a photo of my grandfather being moved into a different vehicle. I immediately called the number back, ready to kill whoever was on the other end. I demanded to know where they were taking him. I was shocked when Tina, Sarah's right-hand woman, was the one who answered the phone. She told me that if I wanted to see my grandfather alive, I had to meet Sarah at her private estate. I felt a surge of pure hatred toward Sarah for using a dying old man as a bargaining chip. I couldn't believe she was stooping this low just to get what she wanted. She was actually holding him hostage just to force me to talk to her. Tina reminded me that I needed to unblock Sarah's number before she ended the call. I was already in my car and racing toward her property at full speed. The Serenity Estates were high-end properties that my own family's company had originally developed. I found Sarah in the main house, looking perfectly calm as she worked on her laptop. She didn't even look up when I burst through the front door. She was busy trying to reconstruct the security tapes from the night I broke into the mansion, which someone had tried to wipe clean. Tina walked up to her and confirmed that I was already on my way to the estate. Sarah just gave a cold, satisfied nod. She let out a dry laugh, knowing she finally had the upper hand again. It took me less than half an hour to get there, and I went straight for her the second I walked in. I shouted at her, demanding to know where she was keeping my grandfather. She took her time closing her computer and looked at me with a smirk that made me want to scream. She pretended she didn't know what I was talking about. I let out a bitter laugh and told her to stop acting like she didn't know exactly who he was. There was no point in her lying since she had used him to lure me there. She looked at me for a long moment before asking if I prefer my nickname or my full, aristocratic name. She had clearly figured out exactly who I was. I glared at her, my hands shaking with rage. I had been using a shortened version of my name for years to stay off the radar while I was working in dangerous parts of the world. I never thought my past would catch up to me like this. She explained how she had put the pieces together by comparing the date of my supposed death to the day she found me in the ocean. My behavior at the estate the night before had confirmed her suspicions. She was now certain that I was the lost Hawthorne heir. She called me the heir everyone thought had been killed in that jungle ambush. I realized there was no use in denying it anymore, so I just admitted that she was right. I stood tall and told her that I was indeed Morrison Hawthorne. She looked at me intently and asked exactly when my memories had returned. I told her it happened the same day. She handed me the divorce papers and told me to leave. I saw a flicker of something like regret cross her face when I said that. I joked that her dumping me was actually the shock my brain needed to start working again. I told her I owed her a thank you for being heartless enough to wake me up. She didn't find my comment funny at all, and her face became even more stern. She asked why I was being so incredibly rude to her. I immediately replied that I didn't see the point in being polite to a woman who had already ended our marriage. She was completely taken aback by my bluntness. She continued to stare at me before suddenly asking what time I had sneaked out of her room the previous night. I felt a surge of tension because I knew exactly what she was getting at. The memory of what happened between us was still fresh in my mind. Just thinking about that night made me want to explode with frustration. Before I could say anything, she stepped into my personal space and demanded to know why Ellie was in my room when she called. She was clearly looking for a reason to be angry with me. She yelled at me, accusing me of sleeping with Ellie the very same night I was with her. I was speechless for a moment because I couldn't believe she didn't realize who had actually been in her bed. I started to wonder if the drug had wiped her memory too. I wasn't sure if she was playing a game or if she really didn't know. I decided to lean into her suspicion and told her that yes, I had spent the night with Ellie. Sarah looked like she had been slapped as her entire body tensed up in rage. She knew we had both been drugged and assumed that I had sought out Ellie to satisfy the effects of the spiked juice. The idea of me being with another woman made her so incredibly jealous that she felt like she was losing her mind. She wanted to hunt Ellie down and make her pay. She shouted that I was a disgusting, shameless person for cheating on her while we were still technically married. I just looked at her with an expressionless face and agreed with her. I didn't see the point in trying to defend myself to her anymore. I told her that my only real shame was spending 2 years acting like her personal servant while she ignored me. Just thinking about how I had lived during my amnesia made me feel sick to my stomach. I had never felt more embarrassed by my own actions. She gave me a look that promised trouble and grabbed my arm, trying to force me to go upstairs with her. I tried to pull back to get away from her, but I lost my footing on the slick marble. I fell toward the floor before I could catch myself. She lunged forward to grab me, but I was already falling. She watched as my head made contact with the sharp edge of a marble table with a sickening thud. As soon as she saw the blood starting to pool, she panicked and knelt down beside me. I looked at her with pure hatred and told her to stay away from me. I tried to hold my hand over the cut to stop the bleeding, but I was feeling too lightheaded to stay upright. I ended up leaning against her because I simply didn't have the strength to push her off. She was visibly shaken and started screaming for Tina to get a medical team over to the house immediately. A doctor arrived shortly after and told her that the gash was deep enough that I would need several stitches. She stayed by my side the entire time, looking terrified. The combination of the drugging, my lack of sleep, and the head injury finally became too much for my body to handle. I passed out before the doctor even finished his work. Sarah stood there in silence, watching the needle go in and out while she tried to calm her racing heart. She began to question her own behavior and why she had reacted so violently to the idea of me being with Ellie. She knew the drug had affected her memory of the previous night, making everything feel like a dream. She was struggling to separate fact from her own paranoid fantasies. She wondered why I would have bothered to leave her side if we were both already under the influence of the drug. The fact that I had apparently chosen Ellie over her was a blow to her ego that she couldn't handle. She realized she was suffering from a level of jealousy she had never felt before. Tina returned with an update, saying my uncle had already found a scapegoat for the spiking incident. He was trying to blame a random maid for what had happened to her. Sarah just laughed because she knew my uncle was obviously lying to protect himself. She knew my uncle was just trying to sweep everything under the rug by offering up a servant. She told Tina to detain the maid and to keep digging until they found proof of my uncle's involvement. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. I didn't wake up again until well after the sun had gone down. I tried to feel the bandage on my head, but Sarah's hand was there to stop me. She told me to be careful because the stitches were still fresh and could easily pull. I stared at her, feeling a mix of attraction and pure frustration. I asked her why she was making my life such a living hell when I had done nothing but love her for years. She just sat there on a mattress and stared at me without saying a single word. I reminded her once again that our marriage was over and that she needed to start acting like my ex. Every time I used those words, I could see the anger flare up in her eyes. She clearly wasn't ready to accept that I was really moving on. She wondered if my old personality had completely replaced the man who used to adore her. She squeezed my hand and told me that she still had the power to stop the divorce papers from being filed. She was threatening to keep me legally bound to her against my will. I felt a surge of genuine fear and asked her if she was out of her mind. I pointed out that she was the one who had thrown me out, and I had finally accepted it. I told her she couldn't just treat me like a toy she could pick up and put down whenever she felt like it. She leaned in and told me in a low voice that I shouldn't test her patience. She reminded me that she still had my grandfather under her control, which was a threat I couldn't ignore. I realized I was still completely at her mercy as long as he was in her hands. I lost my temper and grabbed her shirt, telling her that I would kill her myself if she did anything to hurt him. The sudden jerk of my body made my head throb with a sharp, blinding pain. I had to let go and steady myself as the room started to spin. She put her hands on my shoulders to keep me from falling and told me to calm down. She explained that she had already moved my grandfather to a top-tier medical facility in New York. She promised me that he was receiving the best treatment money could buy and was perfectly safe. She was terrified that if I walked out that door, I would vanish from her life forever. By keeping my grandfather in the city, she was ensuring that I would always be tied to her in some way. It was a cold but effective way to make sure I didn't disappear. I stared at her with narrowed eyes and demanded to know what her endgame was. I didn't trust her sudden concern for my family at all. She let a slow, confident grin spread across her face before telling me that she had changed her mind about ending our marriage. I was completely speechless for a few seconds before I started laughing at the absurdity of it. I asked her what happened to the man she had been searching for 5 years. I mocked her by asking if she was planning on keeping a husband and a lover at the same time. She got angry and told me to stop being stupid, explaining that her search had failed once again. It turned out the man she found wasn't her first love after all. I suddenly realized that the only reason she was keeping me was because she had no other options. My heart hardened as I realized I was just her backup plan. I told her that I wasn't going to sit around and wait for her to find someone better. I made it clear that I refused to be a placeholder for a man who didn't even exist anymore. She tried to deny it, but I didn't believe a word she said. I told her it didn't matter what excuses she made because I had no intention of staying in a loveless marriage. I looked her in the eye and told her that she couldn't force me to love her. She gave me a look that was both challenging and incredibly confident. She told me that I might actually enjoy staying with her if I gave it a real chance. Her arrogance was so intense that I didn't even know how to respond to her. I couldn't believe how far she was willing to go to get her way. Before I could start another argument, she used her final card and brought up my grandfather's safety again. She was making it clear that his well-being depended entirely on my cooperation. I was furious that she was still using him to blackmail me, but I had no choice but to agree. I told her that we would stay married for now, but I promised her that one of us was going to regret it. I was convinced this was just another power play for her. I realized that my newfound defiance was actually making me more attractive to her. I figured that if I just went back to being the boring, obedient husband I used to be, she would lose interest and let me go. I decided to play along and see how long it took for her to get tired of me. She asked if I wanted something to eat, but I just told her I was tired and needed some peace. I lay back and turned away from her, closing my eyes to end the conversation. I heard her stay by the bed for a moment before she finally walked out of the room. Sarah decided to give me some space and headed downstairs to the living room. She noticed my phone was buzzing on the table and saw that Ellie Thompson was calling me. She felt another surge of irritation as she stared at the screen. She was furious that Ellie was still trying to reach me so late at night. She decided to answer the call herself to make a point. Ellie's voice sounded happy and energetic, which only made Sarah's mood even worse. Ellie said she was waiting for me at the nursing home and was confused about where I had gone. Sarah replied with a tone that was cold enough to freeze water, informing her that I was currently with her. There was a sudden, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Ellie immediately lost her temper and started screaming, demanding to know what Sarah had done with me. Sarah remained perfectly calm and reminded Ellie that as my wife, it was only natural for us to be together. She was clearly enjoying the chance to assert her dominance. Ellie yelled back that Sarah was a hypocrite for clinging to a man she had already dumped. She reminded her that the divorce was her idea in the first place. Sarah stayed quiet for a second before her voice became dangerously quiet and intense. She told Ellie that the legal technicalities didn't matter and that I was still hers for the time being. She gave Ellie a final warning to stay far away from me before cutting the call. Tina walked over to her just as she set the phone back down. Tina informed her that they had finally managed to restore the deleted surveillance files from the night at the mansion. Sarah opened the video and immediately saw me walking out of the building in the early morning hours. She began to carefully check the timestamps on all the clips. She saw that I had left the premises at exactly 5:36 in the morning. She then found the footage from the hallway outside her bedroom, which showed Leo King sneaking into her room 20 minutes after I had already gone. Her eyes widened as she realized what this meant. The truth finally hit her like a ton of bricks as she looked at the evidence. She remembered waking up just after 6 o'clock, which was less than an hour after I had vanished. She began to replay the entire night in her head with a new perspective. Since Leo hadn't arrived until after my departure, it was physically impossible for him to have been the one in her bed. She realized that the person she had spent the night with was actually her own husband. She concentrated on the memories of that night, and blurred images of my face finally started to come into focus. She was now certain that it was me, not Leo King, who had been with her. She realized she had been accusing me of cheating and lying when I was the one who had actually been there. She looked up toward the stairs, feeling a massive weight of guilt in her heart. She couldn't understand why I hadn't just told her the truth instead of letting her believe the worst. She felt like I didn't even care enough about her opinion to defend my own honor. Tina interrupted her thoughts to provide the final piece of the investigation. Tina confirmed that my uncle had personally supplied the drug to Leo King to target her. The maid was just a distraction to keep her from digging deeper into the Hawthorne family's dirty laundry. Sarah's expression became lethal as she processed the extent of their betrayal. She gave a direct order to cut all business ties with my family's company immediately. She also made it clear that anyone who continued to support the Hawthornes would be blacklisted by the Anderson Corporation forever. She was declaring an all-out economic war against my uncle. Tina left to execute the orders while Sarah told the staff to prepare a light meal for me. She wanted to make sure I was being taken care of while I recovered. However, her orders were interrupted by a frantic shout from one of the maids on the second floor. The maid screamed that I had climbed out of the bedroom window and vanished into the night. Sarah rushed up to my room only to find the window wide open and the bed empty. I was already miles away, speeding down the highway until I met up with Ellie. Ellie had been coming to get me out of there anyway, and was furious when I told her about Sarah's blackmail. She suggested, half seriously, that I should just get rid of Sarah permanently to solve the problem. She was tired of seeing me being manipulated by my ex-wife. She joked that becoming a widower was a much cleaner way to end a marriage than a long legal battle. I just rubbed my temples and reminded her that I still owed Sarah my life, so I couldn't just kill her. Ellie looked at me like I was being far too sentimental. She claimed she was just joking, but then accused me of actually being in love with Sarah. She told me the only reason I was putting up with her games was because I still had feelings for her. I just stared out the window and refused to give her the satisfaction of an answer. Deep down, I knew she was right about my feelings. My 2 years of devotion to her hadn't just vanished the second I got my memory back. Ellie saw that she had hit a nerve and decided to keep pushing me to face the truth. She reminded me that Sarah was part of a different world and didn't belong in the dark reality I lived in. I told her I was well aware of the differences between us. That was the main reason I knew we could never have a real future together. I was more determined than ever to finalize the separation so I could protect her from my world. I went back to my hotel room to change, but I was too wound up to stay there. I decided to head out into the city to find a way to vent my frustration. Sarah managed to find out where I was staying and arrived just in time to see me pulling out of the parking lot. She wasn't about to let me get away again, so she ordered her driver to follow my car at a distance. She was determined to see where I was going so late at night. I drove for about 30 minutes before stopping at a plain-looking bar in a rougher part of town. Sarah watched me go inside and then followed me through the entrance a few minutes later. She knew this neighborhood was famous for its nightlife, but she sensed I wasn't there for a casual drink. The bar was actually a front for a massive illegal fighting circuit that operated deep underground. As soon as Sarah stepped inside, she was nearly overwhelmed by the stench of alcohol and old cigarettes. The place was packed with people who looked like they were looking for trouble. Despite the late hour, the club was filled with a frantic energy. The loud music and flashing lights made it hard for her to see clearly as she searched the room for me. She realized I had already moved toward the back of the building. A waiter noticed her expensive clothes and asked if she needed help with a table. Instead of answering, she showed him a special membership card she kept in her wallet. The man's attitude changed immediately when he saw it. He verified the card at the bar and then escorted her to a private elevator hidden in the back. He told her to head down to the third basement level and follow the main corridor. She realized the real action was happening far below the surface. She took the elevator down and was nearly deafened by the roar of a massive crowd when the doors finally opened. The atmosphere was electric with people shouting and betting on the fights. She walked out into a huge arena that was filled with thousands of spectators. She saw a professional-grade ring in the center of the room, surrounded by bleachers full of fans. A giant monitor was showing the stats for the local champion, a man known as the Mauler. He looked like an absolute beast of a man. The crowd was made up of high-stakes gamblers and wealthy thrill-seekers from all over the world. They were all screaming for blood as they waited for the next match to begin. Sarah found her way to the executive level so she could get a better view of the ring. She looked everywhere, but still couldn't locate me in the massive crowd. She started to wonder if she had followed the wrong person or if I'd already left. She overheard some men nearby complaining that the next match was an unfair fight against a newcomer. People were making bets that the challenger wouldn't even survive the first round against the champion. They called the unknown fighter suicidal for even stepping into the ring with someone like the Mauler. Most of them didn't think the fight would last more than a minute or two. She was listening to their predictions when she noticed the big screen update with the challenger's details. She felt a chill run down her spine when she saw the name Spectre appear in bold letters. It was a name that carried a lot of weight in the underground world. Even though she wasn't a fan of the sport, she had heard stories about a fighter who had dominated the global scene years ago. He was treated like a legendary figure who had vanished at the peak of his career. No one had ever been able to find out his true identity. The fans around her were buzzing with excitement, unable to believe that the legend was actually returning for a fight in their city. They wondered why someone of his status would bother showing up to a local ring like this. He was considered the greatest fighter to ever step into a ring. He had become a world champion before he was even 21, using a style that was faster and more brutal than anyone had ever seen. He had a perfect record and had never lost a single match during his entire career. Then, Without any explanation, he had simply walked away from it all. His legacy was something that every new fighter aspired to, but could never achieve. The entire crowd went quiet as they waited for the match to begin, sensing they were about to witness history. The champion walked into the ring looking ready to kill, followed by the officiating crew. Everyone in the building was staring at the entrance, waiting to see if the legend was real. A man wearing a plain gold mask finally stepped out and started walking toward the ring. Even though he wasn't the biggest man there, he had an intensity in his gaze that made the entire room feel cold. The fans erupted into a deafening roar as soon as they saw him. The total amount of money being bet on the fight jumped into the billions within seconds. Sarah felt her heart racing as she stared at the masked man, finally realizing who he was. She knew it was me the second she saw the way I moved. She started screaming at the top of her lungs for me to get out of the ring, but her voice was drowned out by the noise of the crowd. She tried to push past the other fans to reach the front, terrified for my safety. She couldn't believe I was being so reckless after having just been hospitalized for a head injury. She kept shouting my name and trying to break through the mass of people, but they were all too focused on the ring to let her through. She felt completely helpless as the bell rang. The match started and I didn't waste a single second. I was across the ring before the champion could even raise his hands to defend himself. I landed a massive punch right on his chin that sent his head snapping back. He was a seasoned veteran and managed to stay on his feet, immediately swinging back at me with a heavy right hook. Sarah felt her heart stop as she watched his massive fist flying toward my face. She was sure I was about to be knocked out. I easily slipped under his punch and used my momentum to launch a counter of my own. I caught him right in the side with a kick that sounded like a baseball bat hitting a tree. He let out a loud groan and struggled to keep his balance as his ribs likely cracked. The fans were screaming themselves hoarse as they watched the underdog dominate the champion. The mauler lost his composure and started swinging wildly, trying to land anything on me. I just moved around him effortlessly, making him look like a complete amateur. He quickly realized that he was completely outmatched and had to focus entirely on just staying alive. By the time we were a few minutes in, he was a bloody mess while I hadn't even broken a sweat. I was picking him apart with surgical precision. It was more of a public execution than an actual competitive match. I finished it with a perfectly timed kick that sent his massive body flying through the ropes and into the front row. He was out cold before he even hit the floor. The entire building was shaking as thousands of people screamed my name over and over again. I just stood there in the middle of the ring as the lights focused on me. My gold mask looked like a holy icon on the massive screens for everyone to see. There was no more debate about whether or not the legend had returned. The fans were acting like they had just seen a religious miracle, and many were already talking about when my next fight would be. The news of my return was going to spread around the world within minutes. While everyone else was celebrating, Sarah was the only one who looked miserable. She stared at my face on the monitor and felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. She realized that she didn't know this man at all. She was disturbed by how cold and vacant I looked despite the thousands of people cheering for me. I seemed like a man who had completely shut off his humanity to do what I did. I had looked intensely miserable and tense throughout the entire match. She sensed that I was fighting through some kind of deep internal suffering. I was starting to get a headache from all the noise, so I looked up at the crowd just to find an exit. My movements were stiff and robotic as I scanned the faces in the VIP section. I caught a glimpse of someone I thought I knew, but I was too tired to care and just walked out of the arena. When I made it back to the street, I found Sarah leaning against my car, waiting for me to arrive. She looked like she had a lot to say. I wonder how she had found me and if she had actually witnessed the fight. I realized she must have known it was me the whole time. She gestured for me to come closer, but I just stood there and looked at her with a completely emotionless expression. All the calm I had found while fighting was quickly being replaced by the usual irritation I felt around her. I asked her what she was doing there, and she immediately snapped back that she should be the one asking questions. She was clearly on the verge of another emotional outburst. She gripped my arm and yelled at me for being so incredibly stupid after just getting stitches. She was also clearly shaken by the fact that the man she thought she knew was actually a world-class killer. She didn't know how to reconcile the two versions of me. All she had felt while watching me was a paralyzing fear that my head wound would reopen or that I would get permanently damaged. She had been desperate to stop the fight before it even started. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and overwhelming concern. I told her with a smug grin that I hadn't even noticed my injury while I was busy dismantling the champion. My arrogance made her so angry she couldn't even form a coherent sentence. She just stood there and breathed heavily, looking like she wanted to scream. She went back to the only thing that worked and reminded me that she was still holding my grandfather over my head. My eyes filled with a lethal rage, and I cursed at her through my teeth. For a second, I truly hated her for being so manipulative. She told me to get into her car, and I complied because I knew I didn't have a choice if I wanted to see him again. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes to avoid having to look at her. She kept staring at me while she drove, probably trying to figure out who I really was. She eventually broke the silence and asked me exactly how many secrets I was keeping from her. She listed out the names she knew, wondering how a person could live so many different lives at once. She sounded almost overwhelmed by the complexity of my true self. She looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle that was missing half the pieces. I gave her a small, empty smile and told her to keep guessing. She told me she would be waiting whenever I was finally ready to tell her the whole truth. We pulled into her driveway just as the sky was beginning to turn light. My head had started bleeding again during the drive, so she helped me get cleaned up and bandaged before I took some medicine for the pain. I sat in the living room afterward, mindlessly scrolling through the news to distract myself. I stopped on a channel that was showing a live press conference with Caleb and Jessica. A reporter was asking them about how their upcoming marriage would affect the merger between our family's business and the Sterlings. They both looked incredibly smug in front of the cameras. The families had been working together for decades, and this wedding was supposed to be the final seal on a total corporate takeover. Everyone in the business world was talking about how this would make them unstoppable. It was a calculated move to secure their power. There was even talk that they were going to fully combine the two companies into one massive empire. Caleb put on a show of being a loving fiancé and claimed that he was letting the older generation handle the boring business details. He was acting like he didn't have a care in the world. Jessica gave a coy smile and told everyone they would have to wait for the ceremony for the big announcement. The reporter then asked her about the rumors that she was only marrying Caleb because of a contract and didn't actually love him. She looked slightly annoyed by the question. The journalist brought up my name and asked if she was still grieving for me or if her heart still belonged to her dead fiancé. Jessica looked disgusted and claimed that she had never seen me as anything more than a brotherly figure. She was completely rewriting our entire history to suit her new narrative. She lied and said our engagement was forced on her and that she was already planning to leave me before I died. Caleb pretended to be sad about my passing, acting like he actually cared about the cousin he had tried to murder. They were both putting on a disgusting performance for the public. He called my death a terrible loss and then turned to Jessica with a look of fake devotion. He claimed their marriage was purely for love and had nothing to do with money or power. It was the biggest lie of the entire interview. He finished by stating that their love was the only reason they were standing there together. I watched the screen with a look of pure loathing, a lethal grin forming on my face. I couldn't wait to see how in love they felt when I finally showed up to crash their party. She had somehow forgotten that she was the one who used to follow me around like a puppy before I left. I never had any feelings for her, but we had stayed engaged to satisfy our families. Now, she was making it sound like I was some obsessed loser who wouldn't let her go. I decided right then that I was going to humiliate them in front of the entire world. I wanted to see if their love would survive the truth about what they had done. My thoughts were interrupted by a new visitor introducing himself to the staff downstairs. The man demanded to see Sarah, and I recognized the name immediately as Caleb's relative. I watched as the maid led a man into the room who was dressed in head-to-toe luxury brands. He looked like the definition of a spoiled trust fund kid. He didn't have a clue who I was and was visibly angry to see another man living in Sarah's house. His expression became even more hostile when he saw that I was dressed in loungewear, making it clear I was staying there. He pointed a finger at me and demanded to know what I was doing in her home. The maid quickly stepped in and introduced me as Sarah's husband. Leo looked like he was about to have a heart attack, unable to believe that the famous secret husband was standing right in front of him. He had clearly heard the same rumors everyone else had. The gossip magazines had always claimed that Sarah's husband was an embarrassment who she kept hidden away because he was so unattractive. Looking at me, he realized the rumors were completely wrong. He tried to act cool and regain his air of superiority. A smug, insulting grin took over his face as he corrected himself and called me her ex-husband instead. He boasted that he already knew our marriage was officially over. He figured that since I was being dumped, I was no longer a threat to him. He treated me like garbage that had been discarded, assuming he had already replaced me in her life. He got even more aggressive and asked why I was still staying at her villa like a parasite. He was trying to intimidate me out of the house. I gave a long, bored sigh and told him he had the story backward. I claimed that Sarah was actually the one who was obsessed with me and refused to let me move out. I enjoyed watching his face turn red with anger at the suggestion. He started shaking with rage and told me I was completely insane to think someone like Sarah would ever be obsessed with me. He looked at me with total contempt and called me delusional. I just yawned in his face and acted like I was about to fall asleep. I told the staff that he was being too noisy and ordered them to remove him from the premises. I was still feeling the effects of the fight and the head injury, and I just wanted to go back to bed. I started walking toward the stairs, ignoring his presence entirely. Leo was absolutely livid and blocked my way, pointing his finger right in my face. He called me her leftover garbage and told me I had no right to act like I was better than him. He bragged that he was the one who was going to marry her next. I looked down at him with an amused expression and told him he was dreaming if he thought he stood a chance with her. Leo gave a smug grin and pulled his phone out of his pocket. He told me he had proof that they were already together. He showed me a picture he had taken while she was unconscious in that guest room. He told me that if I hadn't showed up when I did, he would have finished what he started with her. He was bragging about almost assaulting my wife. He believed the pictures would be enough to blackmail her into a relationship. I looked at the screen and felt a sudden chill when I saw them together in bed. He was holding her close with a disgusting grin on his face while she was completely passed out. I was momentarily stunned, wondering how he could have possibly gotten that close to her. He continued to gloat, telling me to look at the photo and accept that I was being replaced. He was acting like he had already secured his place in her family. He told me I would soon be nothing more than a servant to him. I have a very low tolerance for people pointing fingers at me, so I grabbed his hand and twisted it until I heard a pop. He immediately fell to the floor, screaming about his hand. I had snapped his wrist like a dry twig, and he was now sobbing on the rug. I laughed at his pathetic attempt at blackmail and told him that a single-stage photo didn't make him anything. I promised him that as long as I was breathing, he would never be part of her family. I heard someone start to clap slowly from the staircase, and I turned to see Sarah walking down with a satisfied look on her face. She had overheard my entire speech and seemed genuinely happy with what I had said. She looked at me with a new sense of pride. I just sat back on the couch and waited to see how she was going to deal with the man who had tried to take advantage of her. Leo looked up at her from the floor, actually thinking she was going to help him. He kept calling her name like she was his savior. She looked at him with a gaze that was cold enough to kill. She told him that she had been planning to hunt him down for what he did at the mansion, but was glad he had saved her the trouble. She was disgusted by the photos and decided he had finally crossed the line. He could feel the dangerous energy radiating from her and started to shake with fear. He tried to make up some pathetic excuse about how much he loved her and just wanted to see her. Sarah didn't believe a word of it and looked at him like he was a bug she was about to squash. She ordered her guards to take him to the basement and interrogate him until he confessed to everything. Her security team immediately grabbed him and started dragging him away while he screamed for mercy. He knew exactly what kind of treatment was waiting for him. He begged for her to stop and admitted that the photos were a mistake, but she didn't even look at him. He tried to fight back, but the guards were far too strong for him. His desperate cries slowly faded as they took him down into the soundproofed rooms below. I mocked her for being so heartless towards someone she had supposedly slept with. She immediately corrected me, explaining that I was the one she had been with and that Leo had only snuck in to take the pictures after I left. She made it clear that nothing had actually happened between them. She insisted that she had no feelings for him and that the whole thing was a setup. I felt a weight lift off my chest knowing she was telling the truth, but I kept my face blank. I told her I didn't care about her personal life and that she didn't owe me any explanations. I headed back to my room, but found it impossible to relax. I pulled the blanket over my head and tried to stay still, but a sharp, stabbing pain was starting to spread through my chest. I knew the symptoms all too well. It was the poison starting to act up again. I cursed my luck as the toxins in my system began to flare up after lying dormant for 2 years. I had left my specialized medicine back at the hotel and was completely defenseless. I knew I just had to grit my teeth and survive the next few hours of agony. I was startled when I felt someone climb into the bed next to me. Before I could move, a pair of warm hands reached out and pulled the blankets away from my face. It was Sarah, and she looked genuinely concerned that I was having some kind of episode. She saw me struggling for air and looked like she was suffering right along with me. I couldn't even focus on her face because the pain was so intense that my vision was starting to blur. I just wanted her to leave so I could deal with the agony by myself. She didn't wait for me to speak and just took off her jacket, throwing it onto a chair. My brain was too foggy to understand what she was doing. I watched her, wondering if she was actually planning to spend the night in my room. She gave me a look that dared me to argue and then pulled me into a tight embrace. She told me she was just there to sleep and nothing else. I immediately pushed back and sat up, looking at her with total disbelief that she thought this was okay. She didn't seem bothered by my anger and started tracing patterns on my shirt with her fingers. She whispered that if I wasn't tired, she had other ideas for how we could spend our time. She was being incredibly provocative, and it was hard to ignore. She touched my face and reminded me of what had happened between us at the mansion. I felt a surge of tension and asked her if she had completely lost her mind. I couldn't believe she was acting like we were a normal couple after she had spent 2 years ignoring me. I reminded her that she hadn't even let me touch her hand for our entire marriage, so her sudden affection was insulting. She didn't argue. Instead, she looked at the marks I had from our night together and whispered an apology. Her voice sounded more sincere than I had ever heard it. She explained that she was disoriented when she woke up and didn't know what had truly happened between us. She admitted she was so jealous of Ellie that she had convinced herself I had abandoned her. It wasn't until she saw the tapes that she realized I had stayed with her the whole time. I interrupted her and told her that our night together didn't mean anything and that it was just a physical release. Sarah looked hurt by my cold words. She had been the victim of the drugging, yet she was the one who felt like I was the one tossing her aside like a one-night stand. She asked me if I felt any obligation to her after what had happened. I just laughed and reminded her that I had spent 2 years trying to be a real husband to her, but she was the one who rejected me every single time. I told her that she had missed her chance, and it was far too late to start caring now. She watched me with an intense, curious gaze, still trying to link me to the man from her past. I was tired of her staring at me, so I pulled out my phone and opened my bank account. I decided to treat her the same way she had always treated me. I told her to just tell me how much money she wanted to settle the matter. I started listing off amounts as if I were paying for service. She looked like she was about to explode with rage, but I just kept going, pretending to be bored by the whole thing. I insulted her by comparing her to a high-end escort and suggested she was overcharging for her time. Sarah finally lost her composure and started yelling at me. She was humiliated that I was treating the CEO of a major corporation like a paid companion. She realized that I knew exactly which buttons to push to drive her insane. I told her that she could take the money or not, but I wasn't going to be her husband anymore regardless. Looking at her only made my own frustration and pain even worse. I turned away from her and pulled the covers back up, trying to ignore her presence entirely. I wanted her to just leave me alone in the dark. Sarah stayed where she was, watching me in the moonlight and feeling more certain than ever that I was the man she had been looking for. She waited until my pulse slowed down and she was sure I was deep asleep. She reached out and carefully lifted the hem of my shirt to look at my back. She was searching for a specific mark that would prove my identity once and for all. She looked at my clear skin and felt a wave of sadness wash over her. Despite how much I felt like her first love, she didn't see the tattoo she remembered him having. She sighed and convinced herself that I was just a coincidence after all. She tucked my shirt back in and watched me sleep, her heart full of conflicting feelings. She couldn't help but feel a deep connection to me regardless of the missing mark. She eventually lay down and held me close, whispering a soft kiss against my skin. She told herself it was fine even if I wasn't the man from 5 years ago. I moved in my sleep and unconsciously pulled her closer to me, seeking her warmth. In my sleep, I looked nothing like the brutal fighter she had seen in the underground ring. Being that close to me made her feel a level of attraction she wasn't prepared for. She felt her face getting hot and realized she needed to get away from me before she did something impulsive. She hurried into the bathroom and turned on the cold water to clear her head. She had just finished getting dressed when she heard a woman screaming my name from outside. She stepped onto the balcony and saw Ellie Thompson standing at the front gate with a small army of security guards. Ellie looked like she was ready to start a war. Ellie was yelling for Sarah to come out and face her immediately. She had realized I was missing from the hotel and had tracked my car to the bar earlier that night. She knew I had been in a fight and was terrified that something had happened to me. She knew my medical history and understood that I only went to the fighting ring when the toxins in my blood were becoming unbearable. She had tried to call me a dozen times with no success. After seeing the footage of Sarah loading me into her car, she had come straight to the villa to get me back. She was so angry she hadn't even eaten, focusing entirely on organizing her security team for a rescue mission. She threatened to smash through the front gates if Sarah didn't release me at once. She wasn't going to leave without making sure I was okay. She yelled that Sarah was pathetic for trying to keep a man who had already left her. Sarah finally stepped out onto the porch looking perfectly calm, which only made Ellie even angrier. Ellie rushed toward the iron bars, looking like she wanted to climb over them. Sarah told her that I was resting and shouldn't be disturbed. She also questioned why Ellie was being so familiar with me, using my full name. Ellie's gaze fell on Sarah's silk loungewear, and she realized that Sarah had likely just come from my bedroom. The implication that we had spent the night together was almost too much for Ellie to handle. She felt a surge of murderous intent toward the woman standing across from her. She was convinced that Sarah was using her position to force me into a relationship I didn't want. Ellie warned her that I would never truly love someone who used my family against me. She insisted that no matter what Sarah did, the marriage was already over and I would eventually leave her for good. She was acting as my protector, even if I wasn't there to see it. Sarah's face became like stone as she listened to Ellie's insults. Ellie, thinking she could settle the matter with money, pulled out her checkbook and asked Sarah how much it would take to buy her out of my life. She was trying to treat the CEO like a common opportunist. Sarah was insulted that Ellie thought she could be bought with a simple check. Ellie realized that money might not be enough and stepped up the offer, promising Sarah ownership of an actual diamond mine. She was willing to give up a fortune just to get me away from her. Ellie was still shouting when Sarah turned around and walked back into the house without saying a word. Sarah picked up her phone and made a direct call to Ellie's father, Victor Thompson. Less than a minute later, Ellie's own phone started ringing with a call from home. Her father's voice was stern as he ordered her to leave the city and return home immediately. She was frustrated, but didn't dare to disobey him. She sent me a quick text about a family emergency and then hurried to the airport with her security detail. Sarah watched from above as her rival's car sped away, feeling a sense of victory as she sipped her wine. I spent the next 48 hours recovering from my injuries and the poison flare-up. Finally, the morning of my cousin's high-profile wedding day arrived. The media was treating them like royalty, and the entire city was talking about the merger of the Hawthorne and Sterling families. The ceremony was being held at the Azure Palace, which was the most expensive and exclusive hotel in the state. No expense had been spared for the event. The ballroom was filled with billionaires, celebrities, and top-ranking government officials. The entire event was being broadcast live on several networks and social media platforms. It was designed to be the wedding of the century. People on Facebook and Twitter were obsessing over the decorations and the cost of the jewelry. Everyone was waiting for the first glimpse of Jessica's dress. The hype surrounding the wedding was unlike anything the city had seen in years. The live chat was flooded with comments from thousands of people watching from home. By late morning, the guests had all been ushered into the chapel and were waiting in silence. The music started exactly at 11 o'clock to signal the start of the procession. The minister began the service as Caleb stood at the front, looking incredibly confident in his custom tuxedo. As the orchestra began to play a slow, romantic piece, the massive oak doors at the back of the room were pulled open. Every head in the room turned to see the bride. Jessica looked breathtaking in a white gown that was literally covered in real diamonds. She walked down the aisle with a look of pure triumph on her face. Caleb watched her approach, feeling a deep sense of pride that he had finally won everything he ever wanted. He had spent his whole life wanting her, and now he was finally making it official. He believed his father's advice that power was something you had to seize for yourself. He didn't care that she was once promised to me. All that mattered was that she was his now. He stood taller and gave her a smug grin as they met halfway down the aisle. They walked the rest of the way to the altar together, looking like the perfect power couple. They stood before the minister, ready to say their vows in front of the world. The minister began the formal vows, asking Caleb if he would promise to love and honor Jessica for the rest of his life. The entire room was silent as they waited for his response. It was the moment they had all been waiting for. Jessica gave him a loving look and gripped his hand as she prepared to say her own vows. Suddenly, the back doors were kicked open with a loud bang that echoed through the entire chapel. Every single person in the audience turned around in shock to see who was interrupting. A tall, incredibly handsome man was standing in the doorway, framed by the bright light from the hallway. He had an air of authority that immediately took over the entire room. He was so striking and confident that he made everyone else in the chapel look ordinary by comparison. People in the pews started whispering, wondering if this was a dramatic objection to the wedding. They noticed that my suit was much more expensive and well-tailored than Caleb's. Many of the older guests were staring at me with a look of growing confusion and recognition. I walked slowly toward the front of the room, my every step commanding the absolute attention of the crowd. No one said a word as I approached the altar. It wasn't until I was a few feet away that Caleb and Jessica finally realized who was standing in front of them. Caleb looked like he was seeing a ghost, his face turning a sickly shade of white. He had personally ensured that I was dead, so he couldn't understand how I was standing there in front of him. He felt like his entire world was about to collapse. I gave him a cold, knowing grin and asked if he had really forgotten his own family after only 2 years. He pointed a shaking finger at me and stammered out my name in total shock. He was so terrified he could barely get the words out. Jessica was frozen in place, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Her entire family was in the front row looking just as horrified as she was. I just stood there and enjoyed the looks of pure terror on their faces. I asked them if they were upset that their plan to kill me had failed so miserably. I then turned around to address the entire ballroom, introducing myself as the rightful heir to the Hawthorne legacy. I want to make sure everyone knew exactly who I was. I explained that I had survived the attempt on my life and had spent the last 2 years in hiding. I told the crowd that the reports of my passing were completely false. I made it clear that I was back to reclaim my place as the head of the family. My uncle Richard looked like he was having a heart attack as he realized his dream of taking over the company was over. He knew that my return meant he would be stripped of all the power he had stolen. He tried to hide his fury and put on a fake smile for the guests. He walked over to me and tried to act like a loving uncle, claiming he was overjoyed that I had survived. He lied through his teeth about how heartbroken he had been when they found my body. It was a truly pathetic performance. I looked at him with pure disdain and told him I was surprised to hear he had any feelings at all. He gave a nervous laugh and tried to shake my hand, insisting that family was the most important thing to him. I didn't move an inch to accept his gesture. He tried to usher me away, suggesting that we should discuss family matters in private so the ceremony could continue. He was desperate to stop me from exposing the truth in front of the cameras. I just swatted his hand away and stayed exactly where I was. I told him that the business could wait, but there were more personal issues that needed to be settled immediately. Caleb panicked, convinced that I was there to reclaim my fiancée and humiliate him. He was ready to fight to keep his hold on her. He started begging for my forgiveness, claiming that they had only fallen in love because they believed I was gone forever. He made a dramatic show of his devotion to her, pleading with me to just let them be together. He was trying to act like the victim in front of the crowd. My uncle jumped in to support his son, insisting that they had done nothing wrong and that their relationship was pure. He asked me to be the bigger person and give them my blessing so they could finish the wedding. He was trying to make me look like the villain for interrupting. I gave them a calm smile and told them they had it all wrong. I had no interest in stopping their marriage. Caleb looked relieved for a split second, thinking I was actually going to let it go. I then pulled an old ring out of my pocket and showed it to Jessica. I told her I was returning her family's heirloom and that our contract was officially terminated. I made it clear that I was happy to walk away and never see her again. Jessica looked at the ring in my hand with a look of pure confusion. She was shocked that I wasn't putting up a fight or demanding she come back to me. She had assumed I was still obsessed with her and would do anything to stop the wedding. My indifference was a massive blow to her ego. Caleb actually thanked me, thinking he had won and that I was leaving quietly. My uncle was practically glowing with relief, telling me I was a good man for not making a scene. He invited me to take a seat and watch the rest of the ceremony. I stopped him and turned my attention to Jessica's parents in the front row. I informed them that since the marriage alliance was dead, every single contract between our companies was now null and void. Their expressions shifted from relief to pure terror in an instant. I demanded that the $100 million my family had invested in them as part of the engagement be repaid within 7 days. Her father jumped out of his chair, looking like he was about to have a stroke. He knew his company would go bankrupt without that money. He screamed that only my grandfather had the authority to end their agreement. His wife stood up and glared at me, insisting that the contract was legally binding regardless of my personal feelings. They were desperate to protect their family's wealth. As the sole heir to the Hawthorne empire, I control 40% of the total shares. Are you really going to stand there and tell me I don't have the power to kill a deal? That money was specifically a dowry for a marriage that is no longer happening. Now that the engagement is dead, you are both legally and morally required to pay every cent back. If you have any questions about the legality, Mrs. Sterling, I suggest you call your attorneys immediately. Her eyes flickered with panic before she suddenly grabbed my hand, forcing a fake, loving smile onto her face. Morrison, sweetheart, I understand you are hurt, but Jessica and Caleb haven't actually filed the legal paperwork yet. This ceremony doesn't have to mean anything. Mrs. Sterling shot Caleb a sugary, fake smile and told him that since they weren't legally wed, it was a bit too early for him to be calling her mom. If I stayed dead, Caleb would have inherited the Hawthorne throne, making him a perfect prize for the Sterling family. Now that I was back, he was nothing compared to the actual heir. Mrs. Sterling yanked her daughter close and claimed she always knew Morrison and Jessica were soulmates. She told her daughter to apologize to me so they could dump Caleb and cancel the whole event. Jessica looked at Caleb while her brain worked overtime to calculate her next move. She had feelings for him, but those feelings were tied directly to the Hawthorne bank account. Morrison, please forgive me. I only moved on because I thought I lost you forever. The truth is that I never stopped caring for you. Can we just go back to being engaged? Jessica took the band from me, looking completely stunned. She had probably imagined a dramatic scene where I fought for her love, but I was simply handing her family's property back and walking away. I didn't slide the ring onto her finger. Instead, while the entire room watched in horror, I squeezed the metal until the diamond shattered into tiny pieces and fell to the floor like dust. That was a hell of a performance, Jessica. Unfortunately for you, I have absolutely no interest in someone else's leftovers. As soon as I finished the sentence, I snapped my fingers to signal my next move. The giant screen that had been showing photos of the couple suddenly flickered and changed. A high-quality audio recording began to blast through the chapel speakers for everyone to hear. With Morrison out of the picture, Caleb is the only one left to inherit. Once the marriage is official, the Hawthorne billions belong to us. My Uncle Richard's voice filled the room, sounding colder than ever. Are you sure those mercenaries can be trusted? I don't want any mistakes. Caleb's voice was clearly audible. Richard reassured him that the payment was high enough to ensure a clean hit. And as for my father, we'll put him out of his misery the moment the wedding is over. The recording stopped, and the screen flashed the bank details showing a massive wire transfer to the Black Shark mercenary group. The biggest shock was still to come as a DNA report appeared on the screen. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Richard was not Caleb's biological father. A second document revealed that there was a nearly perfect match between Caleb and Mr. Sterling. The entire wedding party exploded into a frenzy as they realized Caleb was an imposter who didn't have a drop of Hawthorne blood in him. He had been a plant by the Sterling family from the very beginning, designed to infiltrate our dynasty. This entire wedding of the century was just a massive scam to steal my family's wealth. Richard started screaming at the top of his lungs that the evidence was forged. Ellie Thompson walked in with her personal guard, followed closely by a dozen Chicago PD officers who had been standing by. They walked straight to the altar and told Richard and Mr. Sterling that they were being taken into custody. 48 hours later, I was back in my family's mansion, settling the most pressing business issues. I met Ellie in my grandfather's private study, where she handed me a new set of documents. Every person who helped your uncle has been removed from the company. Your grandfather is already settled in a top-tier facility in Manhattan. Sarah Anderson actually sent her own doctors to make sure he's getting the best treatment possible. He's out of danger. I just gave a tired nod and rubbed my eyes while Ellie watched me with a concerned look. She reminded me that we still needed to create a permanent cure for the toxins in my blood before time ran out. We can't access the research lab without the digital key hidden inside that jade necklace. Where is it? I felt my body tense up as I thought about Sarah. I told Ellie that my ex-wife had claimed she threw the heirloom in the trash. She tossed it. Ellie practically shouted in disbelief that anyone could be so careless. She said she was going to track Sarah down and demand it back, but I told her to stay where she was. My voice was low and tired as I thought about everything that had happened. I owe her my life, so just drop it. Ellie looked at me like I was being a complete idiot. She complained that I was still too selfless, reminding me that I had nearly been killed 5 years ago, trying to rescue a stranger in a war zone. I had been working on a relief project when a group of rebels attacked our location. I managed to pull a woman to safety and drew the enemy's fire, so she could get away. I ended up taking a bullet in the shoulder for my trouble. The injury was severe and left me with a permanent mark that most people mistook for a tattoo. After I returned home, I had plastic surgery to remove the scar so no one would be able to identify me from that night. It never crossed my mind that the terrified woman from that rainy night was actually Sarah Anderson. I also had no idea that she had spent the last half-decade desperately trying to find the man who had saved her life. Ellie reminded me that Sarah belonged to a world of light and business, not the shadow world I inhabited. I told her I was well aware of that reality. I knew that the best way to keep her safe was to finish the divorce and stay out of her life forever. Tina walked into the office and handed Sarah the documents she had been waiting for. It was a detailed history of my movements from 5 years ago. She immediately noticed an entry that caught her attention. There was a report about me vanishing for a week after a rebel attack on a medical clinic. The dates and the specific location were an exact match for the night she had been rescued from the insurgents. Her heart skipped a beat as the pieces finally fell into place. She hurried over to her wall safe and struggled to enter the code with her shaking fingers. When the door opened, she pulled out a small jewelry box she had hidden away. She opened the lid to reveal the jade necklace she had lied about losing. She vividly remembered seeing it on me the day she dragged me out of the ocean. It was the one piece of my past I had managed to keep. Are you really going? Sarah asked, her voice shaking just a little bit. I told her that it was time for me to move on. When she asked why I was leaving without a word, I simply reminded her that our marriage was over. The paperwork isn't final yet, she argued as she stepped closer to me. The wind from the ocean blew her hair against my skin, and I could smell the perfume that always used to drive me crazy. I looked at her and saw that she had been crying, which made me feel a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. I told her that we simply didn't belong together. She looked at me with pure determination and asked me to give her a single reason why. Are you leaving because of the man I was looking for? What if I told you that man has been you all along? I went completely still and looked at her in shock. She opened her hand to show me the jade necklace I thought was gone for good. I spent 5 years thinking I had lost you forever. I looked at her, my mind racing with a million different thoughts. She had kept the secret and finally knew the truth about our past. I reached out and gently placed the necklace back around her neck where it belonged. I was shot that night, I whispered to her. The injury left a massive scar on my back, but I had it surgically removed so I could go undercover for my family. That was the missing piece she needed to be absolutely certain. You're such a fool, she cried as she buried her face in my shirt. How could you let me wait so long to know it was you? I wrapped my arms around her and held her tight, feeling her heart racing against my own. She apologized through her tears, but I could see a new sense of happiness in her eyes. I looked at her and told her that I had never truly left her side. I called her my dear Sio one last time, my voice full of genuine affection. I didn't wait for another second before pulling her in and finally kissing her the way I had wanted to for years. The sound of the wind and the crashing ocean waves seemed to disappear as we stood there on the beach together. Real love isn't about perfectly remembering the past. It is about choosing to fall for the same person over and over again, no matter how much the world changes around you.